Imagine having to give up everything that made you who you are. That's what I saw happening to Lance as his disease progressed. And I didn't want him to lose everything. I didn't want us to lose everything. We both loved to travel. When Lance and I were first married, we made a plan that we were going to retire early and we were going to travel the world. And we especially loved road trips. In the beginning, Lance did all of the driving. I maybe would drive for an hour on a 20-hour road trip. He just loved to drive. So when he became disabled to the point that he wasn't able to drive anymore, I took over all the driving on the road trips. So it took me a while to get used to driving that far, but I am so glad that I was able to make it work. And we were able to travel quite a bit for the last decade of his life. And we also flew several times during that time too. So today, Jenna and I are going to talk about tips for traveling, especially when you're dealing with a disability.
This is such a huge thing for people to be informed about, especially in the beginning when they're just getting used to navigating these things with a loved one or maybe even themselves. And now suddenly they have maybe mobility issues or special needs that they're not used to dealing with. So it's good that we're talking about kind of not just the basics, but maybe some details too of how to get through a travel experience in the least difficult manner.
So the way that I managed things was Lance had a lot of medical issues. So I always made sure that we saw his primary care physician shortly before leaving on a trip to make sure that his health was well enough for him to travel and to make sure that we had all the medications that we needed. And then I would always make sure that when we were taking a road trip, that I would see my service advisor at the car dealership where I got the car serviced and let them know that we're taking a trip and check all of the things like the tires and the brakes and the oil and all of those important things. Make sure that the car was in good running order before we left on that trip. And then I would contact the hotels, or if I was using Airbnb or Verbo, just to make sure that accessibility was what they said it was, because there were times that we arrived at our destination and the accommodations were not what they should have been. And so I always made sure to write down the person's name and the date that I talked to them and all the pertinent information. So I knew that I had all of that information documented.
Those are all such excellent points and things to mention. I would add, though, be sure when you are traveling that you speak, if possible, to that specific location or property and not someone at their, maybe call center or reservations desk, because the person that works at that property is going to be the expert.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jenna, because that is something that I learned along the way is that you definitely need to contact that specific location. You don't want to call the toll-free number if you're staying at this chain of hotels. You want to look up the number for that location and talk to the person at that location because yes, they know what accessibility options they have in their specific hotel. Something else when I was driving was making sure that I had everything within reach that Lance could possibly need and that I could possibly need too, because it wasn't safe for him to be reaching around. He had problems with his motor skills, and there were times that he accidentally hit me in the head when he went to reach for something. So I made sure to have everything close by so that he could reach it without having to get out of his seatbelt, which he shouldn't have done anyway. I carried his medications with us all the time. But when we traveled, I made sure that we had at least an extra week's worth of medications just in case we got stranded somewhere, because you never know. I always carried food. I always carried water. I always carried towels, blankets, anything that we might need if we became stranded somewhere. And that just gave me peace of mind while we were traveling. And I was surprised at how often I did access those things when we were on a trip.
Another thing to keep in mind when you are taking a road trip is now you can go onto pretty much any state's Department of Transportation websites and you can access webcams that are all along the interstates and highways throughout the state so that you can know kind of road conditions. There's information on closures, maybe delays that you might have if they're doing construction somewhere. So that stuff is so easily accessible and available. And like I said, every single state has a website for their Department of Transportation where you can access even down to, like I said, the webcam. So you can see, is the area you're going to be traveling in foggy? Are there snowy conditions? And also see if there are road closures or things like that that might impact your travel.
Right. Those are also really great tips. Those are things that were not available when Lance and I were traveling, especially in the early days. I stuck mostly to the interstates when I was traveling with Lance. Sometimes I would go off on the state highways, but I always made sure that I knew where all the hospitals were along the way, just because he had so many medical problems. I wanted to make sure that we were near a hospital in case of an emergency. So I think that's a lot of what I did for traveling by car. Traveling by plane, we didn't do that as much, but Jenna works for an airline and she's got some great tips for us.
Well, I was fortunate enough when I began working for the airline, it was after I had met you. And so you and I had had so many conversations about the different obstacles and challenges that you faced when traveling by air with Lance. I had a really good idea going into it, how I could be assistant to people and just the different challenges that they have. And it really helped me to learn to listen, to pay attention, and to kind of take notes so that I could be helpful to people who maybe were traveling with a disability for the first time. So there's a difference between the well-seasoned traveler that deals with disabilities or mobility issues, things like that, versus the person who's never traveled with any assistance before. They've always been able-bodied. Now they've been in a car accident. So the first thing I would say is make sure that you are contacting the airline ahead of time to let them know what kind of assistance you'll be needing, number one. And if you can possibly speak directly to someone at an airport, even if that means maybe taking a little trip to the airport a week or 2 weeks before your travel to speak to an employee from the actual airline, that can be very helpful because sometimes third-party travel agencies like Orbitz and Expedia, those places are super convenient for booking, but they don't relay information super well to the airline. So making sure that you contact the airline directly for those things, and if possible, speaking to someone at the station. And I know that's an additional challenge, especially for a caregiver, but perhaps you have a family member or a friend or someone who could do it on your behalf. Speaking to the airline is so helpful because they can access your reservation and give you the information that you'll need to get through those airports and travel as seamlessly as possible.
I did find that when we traveled by air, if I contacted the airline directly and gave them my confirmation number, they were able to look up the seats that we were in, and I would tell them exactly what Lance needed because he couldn't go up and down the stairs. And we flew from a small airport. So a lot of times we would be on those smaller planes and we would end up at a bigger airport where we would have to get out on the tarmac. And there was one time that they actually rerouted the plane to a gate instead of making us get out on the tarmac because they would have had to bring a stretcher in and carry Lance down on the stretcher. And that just, that would not have been good for anyone. So contacting the airlines directly with your limitations is very important. And that was so helpful for us.
Well, and it's helpful for the employees at the airline because when we have all that information ahead of time, then we can be prepared and we can reroute, um, move the gate so that you are boarding or deplaning on like a jetway versus, a ramp out onto the tarmac. As you said, if you're at a station that's small, a regional airport, there's a chance you'll be ground loading with a ramp or stairs or something directly onto the tarmac. A lot of times, if there are jetways available, they can move that aircraft to park at that jetway. So then that makes the accessibility way easier. But if they don't know ahead of time or don't have enough time to make those changes, then there's not as much they can do. So that's really important.
So if someone who needs assistance is traveling alone and has a layover somewhere, how can you ensure that the help that they need is going to be at the gate when they arrive to get them to their connecting flight? For instance, I would have never done this with Lance because he had dementia and I couldn't send him by himself. But I do know people who send their loved ones to fly by themselves and they still need that help when they get to the gate. So as a caregiver, I would have been very concerned and I would have wanted to make sure that Lance got to his connecting flight.
Well, that's an awesome question because that is one of the struggles that we see consistently and it's particularly common with people bringing their parents to the airport. That's the most common scenario we see is elderly parents and they're going to travel alone and they bring them to the airport. The first thing I would say is if you can possibly do it, it's always best if you can accompany that loved one or that person to the gate. You can always get a security pass as an escort if you are escorting someone with a disability or that needs assistance to the gate. You can also get a security pass to meet them at the gate when they arrive. So you don't have to drop them off at the curb or the ticket counter. And for some people, maybe that means they're taking extra time off work because they drop their parents off on the way to work and leave them there. We're always there and available to take care of them, but they're going to get much better care from someone who knows their needs and can assist them readily. Per the ADA, the airlines are required to check in on a passenger that's requested wheelchair assistance, I think in 30-minute intervals. So technically they are supposed to have someone checking in on them. I will tell you as an employee, that's very hard to manage when people are coming into gate areas at different times. And some people need more assistance than others. So as much time as you can devote to taking that person and picking them up, that really helps that loved one to have what they need, whether it's being taken to use the restroom or being taken to purchase food or drinks, things like that. I even had a woman once that wanted to purchase souvenirs. I had to tell her no because I couldn't take the time to go shopping with her in the airport. The second thing I will say is communicate to your loved one that if they request wheelchair assistance, that request is added to their entire itinerary. So all stations can see that. If they're connecting to a different carrier, a different airline, that would probably be best to contact both airlines with that information. But typically that information carries over to the other carrier in kind of a minimal way. It's not going to have the details that maybe I could add from my airline. Those details may not carry over, but the request for assistance will. So make sure that your loved one knows if they arrive somewhere and there isn't a wheelchair readily available right then, to just wait on the aircraft, let the flight attendant know that they do need wheelchair assistance, and that help, that assistance will be called for them and usually can arrive within a few minutes. It is their right under the Americans with Disabilities Act to have that assistance available to them and waiting for them. I can't tell you how many times I have encountered someone, and maybe it was just an elderly individual who's not able to walk long distances. They didn't see a wheelchair. Maybe somebody else sat in the wheelchair that was intended for them. Perhaps another passenger thought, how nice, they have wheelchairs available, sat in the chair, and that skycap then took them out of the jetway or into the terminal. Then the passenger that requested the assistance doesn't see the wheelchair and thinks, well, I guess I'll just try and make it in there. And I've encountered people who were nearly ready to collapse in the walkway or in the jetway before they could even make it into the terminal. And I've had to run and get wheelchairs myself and try and get them into the terminal before they collapsed or, injured themselves. And it's just so heartbreaking. And all they needed to do was just wait on the plane and let the flight attendant know that they need a wheelchair. So making sure that they know they've requested the assistance and that they just be patient and wait if it's not readily available. Also knowing that caregivers and loved ones can get a security pass to assist that person at the gate up until they depart. So until they actually board the flight, they can sit with their loved one. And we have that actually quite frequently, that people will come and sit with their parents or their, maybe they have a child with a disability, or it's just a sister or a friend or somebody. They just sit with them and hang out until they're ready to depart.
Lance needed a wheelchair full time. So we traveled with his wheelchair. And there was one time, I think it was the first time that we flew with his wheelchair. We got to our destination and one of his footrests had been broken because they had just taken it at the gate and stowed it there. And then we picked it up when we got off the plane. Do you have any advice for people traveling with their own devices versus using whatever's available at the airport?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I would say the first thing, and this wouldn't necessarily have helped in your case, but I would never, ever, ever check an assistive device, whether it's a walker, a wheelchair, anything like that at the ticket counter. Mostly because anything you check at the ticket counter is going to go through an entire belt system to get ultimately to the aircraft. And those belt systems are rough on bags. Many people think that their bags are broken or damaged from careless airline workers throwing their bags around. And I always tell them, if those people working on the ramp and moving bags, if they were throwing bags, they wouldn't make it through their entire shift because those bags are so heavy and it's so exhausting. So they move them as little as possible. But the belt system is so hard on your bags. There are sorters and long drops and things like that that are, I think they're just destructive to bags, but the process is necessary to be able to get those bags out to the aircraft. Always check those assistive devices at the gate, the same way you would check a stroller or car seat if you're traveling with children. Always check that stuff at the gate. That's going to limit the opportunities for that device to get damaged. In your situation, perhaps it was loaded carelessly, or it was just something that was unavoidable because it's going into this hold with all these bags and boxes and things that are heavy, and things shift and move around. So there's always a risk of damage to those items. On a larger aircraft, it is possible to stow a manual wheelchair in the cabin, depending on the type of aircraft. So always check with the agent at the gate to see if the aircraft you're traveling on does have room to stow a manual wheelchair in the cabin, because that's the best place, or a walker. That's the best place for your assistive device. Another option is using airport wheelchairs. And then there are rental services in most cities that rent assistive devices. So maybe this is power chairs, maybe this is just a manual wheelchair, maybe it's a walker, all those different things. If the airline does damage your device, they can provide you with a rental until that device can either be repaired or replaced. The other option, if you want to bypass all that, is plan on renting a device once you arrive at your destination. You can use the airport provided wheelchair until you arrive there. And most of those rental companies will meet you at the terminal with your rental device and then meet you there to pick it up at the end. So that's a good way to ensure that there will be no issues, that your device, your personal device, is not damaged, and kind of remove that concern or that worry from your head. Although there is a cost associated with it, it can help provide a little extra peace of mind.
I just kind of figured all of this out on my own. So it's so good to have you here sharing these tips with everyone. One of the other things is traveling with medications. You know, we had to do that all the years that Lance was sick. He always had at least one medication that he traveled with. And a big thing is to never check those medications. You always want to keep those in your carry-on bags. And that's something that we always did. But I hear people tell me randomly that they've lost their luggage and their medication was in there. And I've just never understood why you would check your medication.
Surprisingly, people do it all the time. And I can't even count the number of times that I've been in our baggage office and someone's luggage was delayed and they come in frantic because their medication was in the bag. And it's so frustrating. So remembering that that airline employee in that baggage office didn't lose your bag and they want to try and help you with that. So if you ever do deal with lost luggage and perhaps you did check your medication or something that you really need, work with that employee to try and find solutions to get you the things you need. But the best thing you can do is just keep anything that is, particularly medications that are life-giving, keep those with you all the time. If you have a bag, a small bag that contains medications, any kind of medical device, maybe it's a CPAP, whatever those things are that you have to have with you, those items are exempt from what you can carry on to the aircraft. The TSA, at least domestically, only allows you 2 items on the aircraft, but medical devices and medications are exempt from that. So if it's your insulin because you're diabetic, if it is medication that you need, if it's your CPAP, anything like that, that is exempt from those carry-on limits. So make sure that you let that employee, that airline employee, know this is medical equipment, this is medication, it's exempt. That allows you more space to carry the things you need onto the aircraft and keep them with you so you're never separated from those items. Another thing that you can do is be sure that you always carry those things in a smaller bag that can fit under your seat in case there's not overhead bin space and they have to check your carry-on bag, your large roller bag. Then you can still have those medications and medical equipment with you under the seat. You'll never separate from it. If it's in your large roller bag that's expanded and it's not going to fit in the bin or they're out of bin space, then you can just know that your medications, your important things are with you at all times.
That's good advice. I actually did not know that medications and medical equipment were exempt from that. That would have helped me a lot. If you're going to require additional assistance, would you recommend arriving early?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Any additional time you can provide that airline, those employees to assist you is so appreciated. Remember, at the end of the day, those employees are just trying to do their job and they're trying to assist you but you have to give them time to do that and to assist you in any additional details, to make sure and take the extra time to document everything that you're going to need, to take extra time with your assistive device, all those things, particularly if you're traveling with like a battery powered device, a power chair or something like that. Those take a lot of extra time to check in, to load, to transfer the guest from the battery powered chair into a manual wheelchair or an aisle chair and getting that guest on board. Any additional time you can provide to that airline is so appreciated. But that goes for any assistance you might need. So if you are traveling, say you're traveling with a pet, say you're traveling with, you're sending an unaccompanied minor, say you're traveling with a large group or a large family or children, babies, anything out of, I won't say out of the norm, but anything outside of a single passenger traveling by themselves that requires zero additional assistance, you should plan to arrive extra early to allow the airline enough time to accommodate your needs, to allow TSA enough time to accommodate your needs, because that's another part of it, is the additional screenings that might need to take place when you are traveling with someone with a disability. They'll have to check that wheelchair. They'll have to, check you independently from everyone else on the line. And perhaps they would have to call an additional agent to come over and do the security checks on a passenger that is requiring extra assistance. It's very, very important that you provide both the airline and TSA with enough time to complete all their processes and not feel rushed. We don't want you as the passenger to feel rushed, and we don't want to feel rushed, because that's how things get missed. That's how steps get skipped. And that's not the best experience. So it's always better, even if you have to get up extra early, it's kind of hard, but get there 2 hours early, maybe 2.5 hours early. Then you can get through and get breakfast on the other side or get lunch on the other side if you're sitting there for a long period of time.
That was something that Lance and I found out when we started traveling with his wheelchair, is that when you are taking your own devices through the security checkpoints, they have to check the entire device. If we had been able to use an airport wheelchair, they don't necessarily need to check those on the way through. So that would have saved us time. But like I've said in the beginning, we had to use Lance's wheelchair. So that is something to consider, is that they will make extra checks on your personal equipment.
One other thing I think that it's important for us to talk about is whether or not your loved one or yourself, if you are traveling with a disability or need assistance, is the use of an aisle chair. And so this is something that people know if they need one. And if they don't need one, they're probably not going to know what that is. So there's a high likelihood that if you are checking in and requesting wheelchair assistance, you may be asked if you need an aisle chair. An aisle chair is a specially designed wheelchair that is extremely narrow and fits down the aisle of an aircraft for passengers that need assistance all the way to their seat. They're not able to walk down the aisle of the aircraft to their seat. So they're essentially strapped in with their arms across their chest. And then the wheelchair is tipped back and they're actually pulled backward down the aisle of the chair. There's one person on the back side with handles on the chair and one person on the front side by the passenger's feet with handles on the chair. And they wheel you down the aisle of the aircraft. It's extremely uncomfortable for that passenger to be put in that wheelchair and moved in that way. Until we come up with a better device, that's the option that you have available to you. So make sure that you're very honest. If you are traveling with someone with a disability, make sure you're very honest with the airline in describing or explaining how much assistance they need. Don't minimize how much assistance they need, because there's nothing worse than having someone that says they can walk to their seat and we get them to the aircraft and realize immediately they can barely stand up. They can't, there's no way they're walking to their seat. And then we have to bring in that aisle chair at the last minute. And it's stressful for everyone involved, not least of all for the person with the disability. And I think it can be embarrassing for them as well. I've seen many times that it's upsetting to them. And I just hate to see that. Alternatively, don't exaggerate the level of assistance needed, because I've seen that as well, where someone says, no, 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 they need an aisle chair. And I see that passenger getting strapped into that aisle chair and they are shaking their head saying, no, I can walk. I do not want to ride in this. It was very humiliating for them or whatever. And they say, no, I don't want to do that. I'm okay. I can make it. I just need extra time. So make sure that you're very honest and very clear, and ask questions of the agent at the airport. How far is it to the aircraft? How far back is their seat? How much assistance will we be able to have? Work with the airline to determine exactly what that guest needs, so they're not experiencing something that's unnecessarily uncomfortable, but they're also getting exactly what they need and we're not putting them at risk.
Yeah, Lance had to use that aisle wheelchair one time when we flew because our seats were way in the back of the plane. And so after that time, because I watched him ride on that thing with his arms across, and he was a tall guy. It was kind of hard to get him back there, and he really hated that. We were thankful that it was available to him, because he would not have been able to make it back there walking. But after that, I contacted the airlines directly and let them know that this had happened. And is there any way that we can get a seat closer to the front so that we don't have to use that aisle wheelchair? And we never had to use one again. So that was good. And I think one of the most important things in traveling is communication. You know what your disability is, you know what your needs are, and you're not talking to people who are mind readers. So you need to be very clear when you communicate what your disability is. You may not know what they can do to help you, but if you can tell them what your limitations are, then the person helping you can likely offer a solution.
That's such a good point about communication, because at the end of the day, you as the caregiver are an expert on the needs of that passenger, of your loved one. The employee, the agent at the airline, is the expert on the processes that we have available to assist passengers with mobility limitations or disabilities or anything like that. So you need to communicate exactly what your loved one needs or what you need if you're the passenger, and listen when that airline employee tells you what they have available. And if you're not comfortable with the answers that you're being given, I would recommend continue to ask questions and clarify, because oftentimes you're talking about the same things, but using different terminology. And I've seen that become very frustrating on both ends. I can tell you there's always a solution. It might not be the most ideal solution, but there's always a solution. It just requires very clear communication and patience on both ends. So, like I said, just make sure that you're asking a lot of questions and giving a lot of information. A lot of times the frustration that occurs is just a difference in terminology. So using very clear terms like, no, he or she is not able to walk to their seat at all. They can't stand. They can only walk maybe 2 feet. So then that employee knows, okay, this is how far it is. They do need this level of assistance. You can say they're able to walk short distances. That's a very subjective term. What might be short to you is not short to someone else. So saying he or she can walk about 20 feet or from here to there, that really helps that agent to know exactly how to help you. So that communication could not be more vital. That might be the most important point to take away from this entire conversation is communicate exactly and clearly to anybody, to an airline, to an employee at a hotel, anybody that you're encountering whose assistance you require needs to know exactly how they can best help you.
Well, thanks so much for joining me, Jenna, and sharing all of this great information on airline travel. And I will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.